On April 14th of 1865, as the church bells rang with the joyous sounds of surrender, a war-torn America dared to begin to imagine peace after 4 years of brutal conflict and constitutional crisis alike that affected everyone. History, for the story of America, made one of its sharpest turns yet. On April 15th, in a Washington, D.C. boarding house, thick with grief, sorrow, and even shock, Andrew Johnson, Vice President of the war-exhausted second term of Abraham Lincoln, raised his right hand and took the oath of office from Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase. You see, only hours earlier, Abraham Lincoln had died from a bullet fired by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater, and the nation's sorrow had barely begun to settle when its leadership had changed. Johnson, the son of a North Carolina tailor, had risen through grit and stubborn conviction that only a pundit dedicated to his beliefs could hold. A Southern Democrat who had refused to join secession as a prominent senator, he had governed Tennessee for the Union after Tennessee fell to Grant, being recognized as the only Southern politician during the war to go to D.C. regularly and perform his duties as an elected official, and then joined President Lincoln on the 1864 National Union ticket, a pro-unification ticket that let lenient rules for reunification of Southern states, defeating George B. McClellan in a hand-to-hand wartime election. Scarcely 6 weeks after a rocky vice presidential inauguration, he found himself president of a wounded and barely functioning republic. "They shall pay for what they have done," he vowed to the American public. The conspirators were quickly hunted down. Booth was killed and others, including George Atherton, were executed at the request of Johnson personally. Former Confederate President Jefferson Davis was captured and imprisoned. At first glance, Andrew Johnson looked ready to be hard on the South, but the war had ended, hostilities no more, and a larger question began to loom. What exactly would peace look like? So Johnson's answer came swiftly. On May 29th of 1865, he issued proclamations offering amnesty to most former Confederates, with personal pardons required for the wealthy elite who used their companies to finance the war, and appointing provisional governors across the South. He believed, as did the rest of the former Lincoln cabinet that he kept, that the states had never legally left the Union. Therefore, once loyal governments were reestablished, they should return quickly to Congress and the nation can get back to business as usual. Sounds good on paper, right? But in reality, that's a different story. Southern state conventions met to discuss a new constitution. Slavery, the main labor source for their entire continent economy, already mortally wounded by wartime declarations such as emancipation, was now formally abolished in these new state constitutions. Mention that many of the men elected to these new offices had just recently worn gray. Among them was Alexander Stephens, the former vice president of the Confederacy. Even more troubling to Northern observers, Southern legislators began passing black codes, which were restrictive laws binding free people of color to labor-intensive jobs only and sharply limiting the rights that radical Republican representatives were adamant to impose on the economically depressed South. In Washington, Members of Congress fought and argued. The Republican Party was not one unified party, but many sects under the same banner. You see, radical Republican leaders such as Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner demanded sweeping civil rights and black suffrage, such as freedmen's leagues. Moderates wanted fairness and order. Democrats, both North and South, favored swift restoration with minimal federal interference. After all, a 4-year war was literally just fought over an overreaching federal government's approach to state-specific laws. And in between them all lied Andrew Johnson, a president seeking to heal from the wounds caused by the war and to find common, maybe even political ground. Johnson, along with many on the Democratic side, believed voting rights and how they were to be implemented was a matter of state-specific issues, not the federal government. He also believed political power in the South should pass away from the older and wealthier planter aristocracy to the poor white plebeians like himself and the majority of the Republicans. Black suffrage, however, he warned, to the extreme that guys like Thaddeus Stevens and the radical Republicans were pushing, stalling key civil rights initiatives that he garnered that would have gained support on both sides in the process, would produce racial conflicts that saw the rise of anti-black and immigrant groups such as the KKK and Knights of the Red Cross during the post-war era. The collision course was set. In early 1866, Congress sent Johnson a bill extending the Freedmen's Bureau. He vetoed it. The Bureau, he argued, was unconstitutional and too expansive in federal power, allowing states with more freedmen's initiatives and black representation more political sway and power. Shocked Republicans regrouped and passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, granting full citizenship to the formerly enslaved. Johnson vetoed that as well, claiming it discriminated in favor of the color and against the white race, a claim that saw both Democratic and even a few middle ground Republican support. Congress, of course, overrode him. The first time in American history that a major piece of legislation became law over a president's veto. The breach widened. On February 22nd of 1866, George Washington's birthday, Andrew Johnson delivered an impromptu speech at a fundraiser after being verbally accosted by opposing party patrons regarding his support for Democratic initiatives. Attacking his congressional opponents by name, Stevens, Sumner, and the famed abolitionist Wendell Phillips. Well, a president is supposed to sound dignified, professional. Johnson, however, sounded like a drunkard who was giving a stump speech, grilling for a fight. Then came the 14th Amendment. Drafted in Congress, it promised citizenship and equal protection under the law. Johnson opposed it fiercely, but had no formal role in ratification. When it was adopted in 1868, it became one of the most powerful guarantees of civil rights in American history, over the objections of the sitting president and most Democrats. The midterm elections of 1866 were a disaster for Johnson. Republicans won overwhelming majorities in both the House and Senate, putting radical Republicans at nearly 65% majority while moderate Republicans willing to work together with Democratic opposition claimed the minority. In 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts despite his veto and some Republican dissent, dividing the South into 5 military districts. Now, states would have to draw new constitutions, ratify the 14th Amendment, and guarantee black male suffrage before rejoining fully. Johnson called it unconstitutional tyranny, but Congress and the radical Republican majority called it justice. That same year, Congress passed the 10-year of Office Act, requiring Senate approval before the president could remove certain office holders. It was aimed squarely at protecting Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton, a staunch supporter of congressional reconstruction. Johnson loathed the restriction on his authority, and in August of 1867, he suspended Stanton and appointed Ulysses S. Grant as interim replacement, a move which, ironically, would have better strengthened Reconstruction efforts since Grant was, well, literally the head of the U.S. military and just won the Civil War. The Senate reinstated Stanton. Johnson removed him anyway in February of 1868. Stanton barricaded himself in his office. Washington had become political theater. February 24th of 1868, the House of Representatives impeached Andrew Johnson. 11 articles of impeachment were drafted, largely centered on his alleged violation of the 10-year of Office Act and his defiance of congressional oversight. The Senate trial began March 5th. Chief Justice Chase presided. The galleries were packed. The nation held its breath. Johnson did not attend. His lawyers argued that the 10-year of Office Act did not apply to Stanton, who had been appointed by President Lincoln. They also insisted that a president had the right to challenge any law that he deemed unconstitutional. Behind the scenes, politics swirled. Removing Johnson would elevate Senator Benjamin Wade, a staunch radical Republican, to the presidency. Some moderates hesitated. On May 16th of 1868, the Senate voted 35 guilty, 19 not guilty, one vote short of the two-thirds required for conviction. Johnson survived. The Senate later voted on 2 more articles. The results were the same. For the first time in American history, a president had been impeached. And for the first time, the balance of powers between Congress and the executive had been tested at such an intensity. Amid domestic warfare, Secretary of State William H. Seward quietly expanded the nation's reach. In 1867, Seward negotiated the purchase of Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. Critics mocked it as Seward's icebox. Johnson supported the treaty, and the Senate ratified it. The United States also pressured France to withdraw troops from Mexico, restoring stability in North America. Wake Island was claimed in the Pacific. A treaty with China was signed. The Burlingame Treaty strengthened diplomatic relations. Even during chaos, the map of America grew. Another bill that Johnson so famously signed was the Southern Homestead Act, intended to give land to poor whites and freed people alike. You see, land once owned by the wealthy cotton producers who had previously financed the war efforts, had to give up their land that couldn't be farmed without slave labor. This land, prime for subsistence farming, became prime real estate for poor whites and blacks alike. A broad and limited availability, however, mostly due to Confederate expats who now ran the local governments, stunted its impact. He also signed an 8-hour workday into law for federal laborers in 1868, though wage productions undermined its benefits. As a side note, Johnson's term saw the highest number of freedmen employed by the federal government during the entirety of the 1800s. Numbers that would not be seen again until the economic boom of the 1920s. These reforms were real, but often overshadowed due to his failures. The Johnsons sought the Democratic nomination for a second term, but this time he lost to Horatio Seymour and the Republicans, who had the majority of the nation, nominated General Grant. Grant won indecisively. Now, maybe slightly out of spite for having been stalled by Congress on literally everything for the last 4 years, but Johnson issued a final sweeping amnesty for all former Confederates, including Jefferson Davis. On March 4, 1869, he refused to attend Grant's inauguration, breaking tradition. He left the White House alone. So history very easily might have ended there for our first-term president. But Johnson, never one to stymie a political debate, was not finished. In 1875, he achieved something no former president had ever done. He returned to the U.S. Senate from the state of Tennessee. Later that year, he died at his home in Tennessee, surrounded by his family. Now, as of today, President Johnson's presidency is remembered as the one term, the president that was impeached, and that's about it. But it's important to remember that Andrew Johnson's presidency was dramatic, combative, and deeply consequential, and let's not fail to mention, unwanted. You see, he presided over the immediate aftermath of a civil war, clashed with Congress over the meaning of freedom, vetoed transformative civil rights legislation, survived impeachment by a single vote, oversaw the purchase of Alaska, and he issued sweeping pardons that reshaped Southern politics for the next several years. To some, he defended constitutional limits on federal power, and to others, he squandered a historic opportunity to secure justice for newly freed people. What is certain is this: when Lincoln's candle flickered out, Andrew Johnson stepped into a storm, and for the 4 turbulent years, he stood at the center of one of the most dramatic constitutional struggles in American history.